Egypt was a stratified culture. But what does this mean, and what can it tell us about ancient Egypt? Egypt was obsessed with social status because the status in this life affected the quality of your afterlife. And if you like these videos and wish to help out, please hit that subscribe button. It really matters to us. And also, if you wish to help us out financially, please consider becoming a Patreon member or by purchasing my book, The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context, an illustrated journey. Okay, typical Egyptian did not have a lot of material wealth. But what they did have were titles and status and jobs and positions. And these titles and positions and jobs could be inherited from generation to generation. So one's status also determined how well your children did and their children, and again, it affects their afterlife, because the way that Egyptian religion worked was the afterlife was governed by this life. So if you're a brick maker, if all you did was make bricks all your life, when you died in the afterlife, you still were a brick maker. If you were a farmer in this life, and that was as high as you rose, you were a farmer in the next life. Your status between this life and the next life didn't change one iota. So it was really, really important for the Egyptians to ascend the highest ranks as possible. So if you were a vizier, that's the equivalent of a prime minister in this life, you were a prime minister in the next life. This is why Egyptians were so obsessed with titles in their tombs and social class. Now, in Egypt, when we talk about the people, the Egyptians had a couple terms to describe the people. They would talk about the remech. This is all the people, from the lowest classes to the highest classes. But they also had what was called the pot people, which is what we would say is the nice, clean, sophisticated upper-class Egyptians, the good people, the people that counted when the Egyptians really were considering social and political decisions. This was your upper crust of society. And within those classifications are several subclasses that I think we can talk about. Even though Egypt didn't have a caste system like we say find in India, they did have what was called a stratified society. Each class had its own social distinctions and social rank. But unlike a caste system, where if you were born in one caste, you were in that caste for life, it is possible to actually change what class you're in from either up or down. And it was entirely possible to shift rank in Egyptian society, although it was very uncommon. For example, the Chancellor Bey went from being a servant all the way up through being a scribe and ultimately becoming Vizier of Egypt. So it was possible to transcend many social classes in a lifetime, but it was very uncommon. So let's start with the lowest social class of Egyptian society and work our way up to the nobility. The lowest social class in Egyptian society, ironically, is the farmer. It's not a slave. Slaves were not the bottom class of Egyptian society. Farmers were. And this is no disrespect to farmers. But in Egyptian society, farmers were inexpensive, they were common, they held no property, they didn't even own the land they worked. The land typically belonged to somebody else, and they worked their allotment until the inundation came and wiped out their plot. So we know actually very little about farmers. They didn't read or write. Nobody wrote about them. We actually have very little idea about how the farming class lived in ancient Egypt. We know nothing about their marital practices. We know very little about their mortuary practices. We know nothing about their marriages or weddings. There's very, very little that we know about the farmers because nobody simply wrote about them. The next class up from farmer were slaves. Now, we actually know a lot more about slaves than we know about farmers. And slaves are actually a higher social rank in Egypt because they were expensive. You had to buy a slave, and they cost a lot of money. Slaves often had highly specialized skills. Many were vintners, fig notchers, metalsmiths. Many could read and write. They had valuable skills that the Egyptians really coveted. So many slaves were highly valued and were worth a lot of money. We also know that a slave could be given a wife or a spouse if that slave was highly favored by their owners. And interestingly enough, while a slave could never buy freedom, they could sometimes earn it. It was uncommon, but it did happen, where a slave would be adopted and then given their freedom. Now, adoption as a slave did not necessarily come with freedom, but they could be given freedom once they were adopted by a free person, typically the owner. At death, slaves were then usually inherited by the next generation. So the death of your master did not mean freedom. It meant you were someone else's property at that point. And as we had noted previously, some slaves did manage to earn their freedom and rise to very high ranks in Egyptian society. It also should be pointed out that when a slave was freed, it was usually as an adult, after that slave had proved their worth. So children were not often adopted as sons and daughters and then freed. So that was it was mostly an adult practice of adoption at that point. Okay, the next rank on our class list, and actually the first rank of the pot people. So the previous two ranks are remech. The following ranks are going to be pot people or the upper class. But this next class is sort of our middle class of Egyptian society, and that is the artisans. Now, the artisans were the people who made funerary furniture and the tombs of the nobles and kings. Some were carpenters, some were metalsmiths, some were stone cutters, some were decorators. And they all lived together in sequestered villages, under constant guard, because they were often entrusted with precious materials that were given to them by the king. Many craftsmen were literate, because they had to be to decorate the tombs. And they all received rations from the king that usually consisted of bread, salted fish, and wine. And generally, artisans were free to marry and divorce whomever they wanted. So they had the freedom to come in and out of marriage in a way that we don't see with, say, slave marriages. In addition, artisans were also free to take work on the side to earn a little extra money. So they would often take requests from the local community to build coffins and funerary biers and create better burials for the surrounding community, as long as it didn't interfere with their obligations to the king. So they were actually able to become quite affluent within their little sequestered world. The next strata we're going to talk about, the next class, is the army. These were the people that served as soldiers for the Egyptian king. Now, like any army, the Egyptian army has rank. Okay? And they were essentially 4 main ranks in the Egyptian army. And your rank in the army depended entirely upon what you could afford for equipment. Unlike a lot of armies where rank is earned, in the Egyptian army, rank is bought. So whatever equipment you could afford when you enlisted determined your rank in the army. The lowest rank within the army were the archers. Next up were your infantry, because you had to buy a spear and shield, things that an archer didn't have to buy. An archer could just make most of his own stuff, most of his own equipment. Then next up were the charioteers, the people who rode the chariots. These were sort of the upper class soldiers, were the charioteers, because they had to buy the chariots that they drove. And then above that were the officers, and most of the officers ended up being selected from the ranks of the charioteers. So what you could afford coming into the army really influenced what your rank was once you were in the army. And of course, once you became an officer, you could go to the very top and even potentially become vizier and, on really rare occasions, king of Egypt. This is what happened in the case of the reign of Horemheb and Ramses I. Both those kings started off as generals. They were in the army. So it was possible to go from army all the way up to king. Now, it is important to point out that talk about the next 2 classes, the priest and the scribal class, that many are actually overlapping tiers with the army. So in a sense, these last 3 social classes, the army, the scribes, and the priests, can be at times overlapping or equal. Now, in the case of the priests, it has a similar social status to soldiers. And many other occupations could also be inducted into a priesthood. For example, many soldiers also served as priests. Men and women could be priests, depending upon the religious cult. For example, most of the priestesses of Hathor were women. There were very few men in that cult. And priests and priestesses could marry, and marry into professions outside of their own occupation. Priests received a ration from the temple where they served. Some were literate, some were not. For example, Wab priests, what was called sometimes purity priests. These were the priests that purified themselves, and they would do cleaning inside the temple, they would do the heavy lifting, but there wasn't a lot of call for them to read. So many Wab priests weren't actually literate. On the other hand, The Heri Tep, or the lector priests, were all literate because they would have to read incantations and spells. So even being a priest had varying literacy. Then we've got the scribe class. Now, scribes were central to the administration of Egypt. Without scribes, the massive bureaucracy of Egypt simply wouldn't work. Unlike priests and in the army, all scribes were literate. It came with the job. And scribes learned to read and write at what was called a kop, which was a special school where the upper class, scribes, and even the royal crown prince learned to read and write. And it is there that they learned the various exercises they needed to become good at their profession. Now, every scribe learned to read and write Egyptian, both hieratic and hieroglyphic. But some scribes also were multilingual. Some of them knew how to read and write Akkadian. This was necessary because scribes were sometimes tasked to write foreign diplomatic correspondence, so they would have to learn to write in what was the lingua franca of the region, which was Akkadian. So scribes could be attached to any part of the bureaucracy of Egypt. Some scribes were assigned to, say, grain silos to tabulate how much grain was harvested. Some were assigned to taxation. Some were attached to military units where they went with the army to count the dead. Wherever they were assigned, their post was considered to be a very, very high-end position. So scribes represented much of the upper class of Egypt. And scribes that were really, really good at their occupation could even expect to at some point visit the royal court, become a royal courtier, or even potentially marry into the royal family. Many of the princesses of Egypt were married to scribes. And scribes could even ascend to the rank of vizier, which was the next position just below the king. Now, beyond the army, the priests, and the scribes, you had what was called the nobility. And the nobility were the people who were either connected to the royal family or were part of, say, the families of the hereditary governors. Much of the nobility inherited their positions from their fathers. So it wasn't uncommon to see a line of, say, hereditary governors that extended centuries. But this was sort of your noble class tier. Those who sort of fell out of that noble class would then become assimilated into one of the other social classes, such as the army, priesthood, or scribes. So what you have in Egypt is this stratified society that went from farmer to slave to artisan to army to priest to scribe to the nobility itself. So when we talk about society in ancient Egypt, we always have to be cognizant of the fact that it was a class-based society. It was stratified, but yet people could go up or down within those social strata. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.